the kind of regime which is willing to stump up the $1 billion for a permanent seat. Remember, you can be on temporarily on a sort of bargain plan. Might well be actually the kind of more authoritarian type regimes which definitely are not friendly to the West.
Let's talk more about the geopolitical situation, and this is an interesting one. Vladimir Putin has been invited to be part of Donald Trump's peace board for Gaza, apparently. That news comes from the Kremlin, which says the Russian leader is thinking about it. He's studying the proposal. Now, other members already include, we know, Tony Blair, US Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and the leaders of Canada, Egypt, Argentina and Turkey. The Times reports that the UK does have reservations about joining, with permanent membership costing nations a cool $1 billion each. Mark Galeotti is an expert on Russian security affairs and director of the Mayak intelligence consultancy. Mark, first of all, are you surprised that Vladimir Putin has been invited to join?
Yeah, it does seem rather surreal, though let's be perfectly honest, these days the surreal is the norm. But on the other hand, I can absolutely see the rationale from Trump's point of view in that on a logical level, one could say, well, Putin's involvement would actually help balance out this notional border peace. And on a rather more mercenary level, well, if Putin's willing to stump up $1 billion, I'm sure Trump regards his money as good as anyone else's. But in the current circumstances of the war in Ukraine, to have Putin on any kind of a peace board does seem truly bizarre.
Yes. Do we know where this $1 billion goes?
Well, it's never been tell. In theory, I mean, it's not going into Trump's pocket, or at least not directly. No, the idea is, as I understand it, that this money then becomes sort of a kitty at the disposal of the Council of Peace to be able to oversee the reconstruction of Gaza and all these other wonderful projects. Now, if we look at what's happened already in Venezuela, where the first contract for oil has gone to one of President Trump's cronies, and what might well happen in Greenland, a cynic would suggest that actually a lot of this would be parceled out to Trump's friends, his campaign financiers, and so forth. But at least the idea is that this money would be used for the reconstruction of the region.
Right. And is there perhaps thinking at some level that if you get Putin inside the tent, sitting permanently on this board of peace, then, I mean, is it naive to think he might behave better?
Well, I mean, it's not as though Russia's presence on the UN Security Council seems to have been a particularly moderating impact. It may well be. I mean, as I say, I think one thing that the Russians have done under Trump, which they didn't do under Biden, is very much compartmentalize their relationship. So they can say, well, this is what we're doing about Ukraine, but that doesn't necessarily have to bleed out to issues of economic cooperation or nuclear proliferation or the like. So in theory, Putin one could imagine, play some kind of a positive role here. But the degree to which if nothing else, just the optics of not only abandoning the attempts to isolate Putin, which weren't really working, but actually to invite him onto this top table so long as he's willing to pony up the $1 billion. I mean, that certainly would make it very, very difficult to sustain the line that, in fact, Russia is beyond the pale at the moment and needs to be kept on the international naughty step.
Right. And would other members of the board be happy to sit there alongside Putin then?
Well, I mean, obviously it depends on who ends up on the board. I mean, we understand, and again, none of this has been confirmed, but that President Lukashenko of Belarus, one of Putin's closest allies, but also a dictator who has been heavily sanctioned by the West, has also been invited. So, I mean, I think that the members of the board who, shall we say, are Western affiliated might well have trouble. The danger is, of course, that the kind of regime which is willing to stump up the $1 billion for a permanent seat, remember, you can be on temporarily on a sort of bargain plan, might well be actually the kind of more authoritarian type regimes which definitely are not friendly to the West. So, yes, we'll have to wait and see quite what kind of a company Tony Blair ends up finding himself in.
Yes, I mean, it's just all very bizarre. I mean, is the long-term aim just to take on the UN?
I mean, look, you're asking me to crawl into the recesses of Trump's mind, which is hardly a fair ask. Look, it's very hard to know, and it's frankly hard to know even if this border peace, as currently envisaged, is even really going to actually sort of take off and become a meaningful entity. Certainly, if it happens, what it means is in some ways Donald Trump is indeed creating yet another alternative world order. We've already got in some ways the Chinese constructing their own parallel to and in opposition with the sort of the Western dominated one. Now we actually see Trump creating his own, in which he will be in bed with a whole variety of deeply unpleasant and anti-democratic forces. So yes, I mean, if it's either an alternative UN or at the very least, it's a massive means of undermining the UN, which we know Trump mistrusts.
Right. I mean, and just going back to Gaza, which is where it started, has the word Gaza now been removed from the title of the Board of Peace, by the way?
Well, yeah, it does seem to be. Again, we see so many different iterations. It does seem to be, which is, again, another warning sign that this may well be, in Trump's mind or the mind of the people around him, at least envisaged as something that becomes something bigger than just a very, very specific response to a particular terrible crisis, but instead, as you say, a kind of alternative Security Council or something similar. Because if it is a generic border peace, what's to stop Trump then saying, and this will also be involved with Ukraine, for example?
And just explain what influence, if any, Putin has on, for example, Netanyahu. Are they relatively close?
They're actually quite close personal friends, and in some ways, this was an issue which the Russians were very annoyed about. That when the terrible Hamas attacks on Israel took place, at that point, Russia was still quite dependent on Iran for missiles and drones. This was the early stage of their war in Ukraine, and therefore, in a way, they had to go along with Iran. They had to side with Hamas, and in the process, burn a lot of their relationship with Israel. The Russians are actually quite keen to get that back. They've always regarded their relationship with Israel as actually quite a useful one in the Middle East, a counterweight to countries like Iran. And I think from Netanyahu himself, who's also quite internationally beleaguered, he would quite like to feel that the Russians are, even if quietly, also on side. So, we're going to see all kinds of what might seem sort of strange, perverse alliances and relationships being sort of played out in the whole Gaza peace process insofar as it works.
Yes, I mean, it's absolutely fascinating and incredibly confusing. And you, for the people of Gaza, you do wonder whether peace is actually any closer. What do you think?
Well, look, I mean, I think peace is always something that was actually going to be resolved by the issues on the ground. And in some ways, both sides are beginning to actually have to accept that they are reaching a point of exhaustion. And it's usually exhaustion that ends these kind of conflicts more than anything else. The big question is, you might say, whether actually the opinions of the people on the ground get ignored now in the process, that they actually just simply get swallowed up in these grand geopolitical bargains being taking place. So, if the people of Gaza don't really have a say, yes, they may have some kind of peace, they may well have some kind of redevelopment, but the stake, which is going to be absolutely crucial for making sure that they don't find themselves once again, at least some of them, turning to terrorist tactics, that sense of a stake in their own future, that's not going to be very clear.
And I'm sorry for my slightly sort of scattergun approach, but there's just so many questions that I want to ask about this incredibly complicated situation on planet Earth right now. What does Putin make of Trump's endless references to Russia and China being interested in Greenland? I mean, is Russia interested?
Yeah, I mean, the Russians are loving this. And interestingly, Putin himself actually came out with a kind of little, he does tend to think of himself as a sort of historian, Monkey, even though he's a very bad historian, but he came out with a little sort of historical rationale for why actually America has some kind of a claim to Greenland. Look, from their point of view, Greenland matters because obviously this is a route not just for their shipping, but also for their submarines. But they don't really think that an American invasion, conquest, buy up, whatever it is, would really change the situation on the ground. But the prospect of a Western alliance that is tearing itself apart, and even if they manage to get past this particular crisis, even if Trump is talked down, the legacy of mistrust is something that is going to last for a long time. So if, for example, you're looking at the Russian media at the moment, they are absolutely loving this.
Thank you. Mark Galeotti, who's an expert on Russian security affairs.